The first part of hypothesis testing is going to be developing the hypothesis statement. And one of the key things about the hypothesis statement is that it is strictly a function of the claim. That's why we're going to start off translating the claim, setting that up. That's going to be used to build the hypothesis statement. The hypothesis statement has two parts to it, the null hypothesis and the alternate hypothesis. I'll typically use H sub A. There's a couple common ways that it can be abbreviated. Null hypothesis, fortunately, is always H sub O, so whatever the other one is, that's the alternative hypothesis. So the null hypothesis, one of the things to keep in mind about the null hypothesis is it represents the status quo, how things are. When we see a claim about a population, that claim is based on what the reality has been, or what is theorized about something. So in general, we believe coins are fair. So that's going to be our status quo, that the coins we're working with are fair, unless we get enough evidence to the contrary. Kind of like in a criminal case, the null hypothesis, they presume the defendant is innocent, unless there's enough evidence to the contrary. Now, the prosecutor, who's the equivalent of the researcher, believes that the defendant is guilty. That's why there's a trial, and it's up to the prosecutor to have enough evidence to move away from that presumption of innocence, to go ahead, find them guilty. And the alternative hypothesis sort of represents a guilty verdict, a change from the status quo. The null hypothesis is the big no hypothesis, as in it may stand for that there's no difference if we're comparing things. There's no change if we're looking at an individual thing. There's no relationship if we're looking at whether or not items are related somehow. And for something like drug testing, there's no effect. Whatever the item is, we're going to assume that the item doesn't work. So all of these things are captured by the null hypothesis, represented by the null hypothesis. And the fact that it has the equal case. So the null hypothesis, which after seeing us write it out, you understand why we abbreviate it. It always has the equal case, no exceptions. The alternate hypothesis, and depending on the author, you see it, alternative hypothesis, alternate hypothesis. This represents a change. So this would represent that there is a difference, a change, a relationship, or an effect. The new drug works, this weight loss program works. That's what's represented by the alternate hypothesis. And the alternate hypothesis always gets the strict inequality. The idea between the null and alternative hypothesis, same as in a criminal trial, is that they're representing opposite cases. If it's not one, then it has to be the other. If it's not equal, then it has to be some sort of inequality here, and we're going to allow for 3 possible cases depending on what the claim is. So the alternate might be that we're lower than whatever the value is, or higher than it, or we'll use the not equal if we're looking for any difference. Now, when it comes to actually carrying out this process, let me slide back over here. The steps that we're going to use here is we're going to rewrite the claim in symbolic form, and we're also going to write the opposite case of the claim. It works out easier that way when we're going through it. The null hypothesis always gets the equal case, no exception. The alternate always gets the strict inequality. And even though that's enough to finish the hypothesis statement, we're going to go one more step. And this is about the conclusion at the very end. But if we do this step early, it's going to make writing the conclusion a lot easier. So let's go over to some examples. And I'm just going to work through the first one here. You do have access to all the rest of them. But when we're going ahead and they want us to express the original claim in symbolic form and then identify the null and alternative hypothesis. When we go through and do this, one of the things to keep in mind is we only care about the claim. Anything that they tell us about the sample, we don't care about yet. We will care about it, but not yet. So in number 5, the claim is the first sentence here. After that, they're talking about the sample. So we'll get to that later on. So for right now, you're just looking for what it's saying about the claim. And our claim here is most adults would erase all of their personal information online if they could. Now, the question is, what parameter are they making a claim about? Well, if you think about the question here, would you do something? Would you not do something? The answer to that would be like a yes, a no, categorical variable. They're making a claim about a proportion. And what it means to be most adults, what it means to be a majority, is that's greater than 50%. I also said, in addition to the claim, we want to write the opposite of this. Mr. Pelfrey, I know, will, instead of opposite, he says the negation, same idea, and it's going to be the same parameter. If it's P in the claim, it's P in the opposite. If it's 50% in the claim, it's 50% in the opposite. And now we have to include, all the cases that aren't greater than. Well, there's 2 things that aren't greater than. There's less than, there's equal. So there's 3 possibilities. We need to make sure they're all represented there. So this was all part A. And part B, we're going to write the hypothesis statement. And HO and HA, these are just labels. They're not equal to anything. They're not greater than anything. They're just labels for things. And when we go to write our hypothesis statement, whatever the parameter is in the claim, that's the parameter in the hypothesis statement. Whatever the number is in the claim, that's the number in the hypothesis statement. And just like before, anytime we had a percentage that we had to plug into StatDisk or a formula, we had to convert it into decimal form first. So that's why you'll see me write those in decimal form. And then we need to put what goes in between them. Now, it's always, always, always equal between the parameter and the number in the null, so we put the equal there. And then in the alternate, we need the strict inequality. And our strict inequality here is the greater than. And at this point, we've identified the null and alternative hypotheses, but here's where I'm going to ask you to do one more thing, and this will make your life easier when it comes time to write the conclusion. We're going to put an R over an S there. Down the road, R is going to be about rejecting the claim. S is going to be about supporting the claim. We got to figure out which one of those two phrasings we use. Well, here's where we take a look at which part of the hypothesis statement matches up with the claim. So our claim was P is greater than 50%. Our alternate hypothesis is P is greater than 50%. It is the alternate hypothesis that represents the claim. And when we get to writing the conclusion, we're going to talk about supporting the claim. Now, maybe we do it, or maybe we don't have the evidence. We'll find out about that later. But there's one part of writing the conclusion that's talking about either rejecting the claim or supporting the claim. And we're going to use the phrasing that's based on which part of the hypothesis statement is representing the claim here.